All right, great. I'm Randy Riley. I'm the state librarian at the Library of Michigan, and we are lucky enough today to have Dan Charnas join us. He is the author of the 2023 Michigan notable book, Dilla Time, The Life and Afterlife of Jay Dilla, the hip-hop producer who reinvented rhythm. Dan is also the author of The Big Payback, The Business of Hip-Hop, and Work Clean, The Life-Changing Power of Mize and Place to Organize Your Life, Work, and Mind. Thank you for being with us, Dan. Glad to have you.
Thank you. And since you're not far from Detroit, you need to get your French pronunciation right. It's mise en place.
Okay,
mise en place,
all
like
right.
Detroit.
I'm a very mid-Michigan hayseed, so you would probably be not shocked at what I could mispronounce. You were part of our notable book author tour, and you got to visit some libraries in Michigan. And I was lucky enough to be able to be at one of your events, was at the Detroit Public Library. So there was a lot of energy in the room. There was a lot of feedback, and you were getting to do a lot of give and take. How's that compare to the normal kind of solitary life? Because you do a lot of research for your books. You spend a lot of time alone editing and perfecting them. And then all of a sudden you're out in person and you're getting this feedback. Is it something that's expected? Is it just an added benefit when it kind of that vibing with the crowd works? How do you experience that?
I'll tell you, it's a great question. I mean, I also have the benefit of being a college professor at NYU, so I'm always part of a give and take that never stops. And hopefully the classroom is always energetic, but Dilla events in particular attract a particular kind of energy, fan energy, sometimes stan energy, but this was the first live event that I had done in Detroit, because remember, when the book came out in February 2022, it was in the middle of Omicron. Yeah. So we had gone virtual, and I did a lovely virtual event with Source Booksellers in Detroit, but that did not compare to actually being in the city and to be with people, even folks who had worked with Dilla, were family with Dilla. That was a really just an amazing opportunity. And, it definitely, because it was my first live event in Detroit, felt a little anxious, right? Because I am not a Detroiter. I'm from New York. And I really felt like it was important to say, look, I'm not an expert on Dilla. I'm a journalist who spoke to the experts, and my skill in doing this book is really one of synthesis and trying to stand back from a story that's about Detroit and about one of its important people.
Yeah, and I think that's the great thing about your book, is that obviously you have very positive feelings towards Jay Dilla and what he did, but in the book, you're a journalist, not a PR guy. I mean, it's a pretty truthful story of that. It's not just, hey, let me write a book that's just promoting him. It's talking about that whole situation. And I think that was a really fascinating story.
Thank you. Yeah, it's interesting. The thing that allowed this book to become successful was that sort of rabid fandom or standum that is almost worshipful in its approach to Dilla. But I also felt like what Dilla really deserved. He deserves all of that, right? Yeah. But what he also deserved was a true biography and a true musicology. Right. And that's what I endeavored to do with Dilla Time.
Now, you're a New York City guy, but you have solid connections to Michigan. Can you explain what those are?
Sure. Well, my very first trip to Michigan, as somebody who had never been there at all, was in 1999, when I was a young record executive and producer, and I came from Los Angeles, where I lived at the time, to Detroit to work with Jay Dilla, JD himself. He was JD back then. And that was about 3 days, first time in Detroit, went to Dilla's basement, hung out with him for a little bit, went to the recording studio with him, and it was done. And it wasn't until maybe 9 years later that I met the woman who would soon become my fiance and then my wife. And she was from Detroit. And so I came out about 9 years later, so it was 2008. And Wendy Walters, my wife, was the first person to really give me a tour of a cultural tour and a cultural history of the city. And so since then, since 2008, Detroit has been, our a second home, a summer home. I like to say I spend I summer in a former French colony off the northern coast of Canada.
Right.
So
through your wife, we'll claim you as one of our own, a Michigander. So, but give me some background on yourself and how did you become a writer and why the focus on hip hop in your life?
Sure. Well, I mean, like anybody of my generation, Gen X, we grew up with hip hop as part of popular culture. I think my particular journey into hip hop in particular and the industry where I started was, sort of looking at how hip hop fit into our whole sort of cultural scheme, our racial cultural scheme. And I ended up majoring in African American studies at Boston University. And my thesis was called Musical Apartheid in America, the Sociocultural Ramifications of Racial Segregation in the Music Industry. And so I had a very sort of, as a musician and as a producer, I had one relationship with hip hop, but also as an academic, I had another relationship with it. And so with all that, I ended up going to work in the mailroom of a small independent record label called Profile Records in 1989, which was the home of Run DMC and Rob Bass and Special Ed and a lot of very classic hip hop acts. Shortly after I joined Profile Records, I also started writing for The Source magazine, which was the very first national hip hop magazine. It was also based in Boston. And then I went to work for Rick Rubin, who was the co-founder of Def Jam, who had started a new record label in California called Def American. And so I worked as an A&R person and a producer in the hip hop business for, I don't know, 10, 15 years.
Yeah, there may be a book in itself working with Rick Rubin.
Indeed. Well, some of that did make its way into my first book, The Big Payback. But so that was sort of my journey into hip hop, partially just as a musician and producer, but also partially somebody who studies and writes about culture.
So what motivates you to write? I mean, you're doing a lot of things. You're teaching, you're writing, you're still got your hands in music stuff. So what's your writing process? So you're a guy who I'm taking 3 hours every morning, I write every day, or is it a little different than that?
I think every phase of writing is different. The drafting phase, right? Actually, drafting isn't first. Reporting comes first for me. Everything starts with reporting because I see myself as a journalist first, sort of writer second, a reporter first. And so part of that is just having conversations, lots and lots of conversation. There were 200 different folks that I interviewed for Diletime over the course of, 4 years, multiple interviews and readbacks with certain folks. And my professor, Kim Nauer, at Columbia Journalism School, always used to say, reporting enables writing. And whenever I feel blocked in my writing, it's usually because I don't know enough. It's because I haven't reported enough or haven't researched enough. So drafting was, I don't want to say easy, but it was much easier than the reporting side, because once I have the raw materials, I can go. But yes, I do like to try to knock out, if I can go for 500 words, 1,000 words, 1,500 words. Usually I have no problem generating words. It's cutting that's my issue.
Okay. So you talked a little bit about this, but can you tell me more about how you got the idea, how to write Diletime, and briefly, if you can do it briefly, explain what Diletime actually is in that concept.
Yeah. My book ideas don't come like this. And for many years, I wasn't even thinking about writing a new book. I was making TV. I was doing I was teaching. And the chair of the department in which I work at NYU, Jason King, had, he understood that a lot of my students loved Jay Dilla, and I had obviously worked with him. So he suggested that I teach a class on Jay Dilla. And I said, I'll do it as long as I can take all of our students to Detroit on a field trip. So literally in 2017, we took 20 NYU students to Detroit for 3 days. And
that had to be a trip.
It was a trip. It was a trip in so many different ways, right? And so we did 3 days in Detroit, and then we did 7 weeks in New York. But the problem as a professor, especially teaching students in recorded music, that's just the Clive Davis Institute of Recorded Music, that there wasn't a lot of stuff about Dilla that was musically accurate for them to read. So by the end of that course, I vowed essentially that I was going to write a tiny musical, like a short book about a great musical accomplishment. It didn't turn out that way, because once the reporter's muscle takes over, it starts to expand. And so it became biography and musicology. But the point about Dilla is, and what Dilla time is, the time field from which the book takes its name, is that what Dilla did as a hip hop producer is tantamount to some of the greatest musical accomplishments and innovations of the last 100 years. And I know that sounds crazy to some people. How can Dilla be the same as a Miles Davis or a Coltrane or a Billie Holiday? But you will notice that so many modern jazz artists view Dilla, this hip hop producer, as an inspiration to them. So why is that? Well, before Dilla, our music had 2 different time fields, essentially: straight time, where beats are counted evenly, and swing time, where they're uneven. Da, 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 da. And you can hear that in our popular music, in jazz, and rock, and country, everywhere, right? And sometimes there are songs that go back and forth between swung and straight. But we've only really ever had the 2 in our popular music until 1998, when Jay Dilla, working on an MPC drum machine, began to create a kind of new time feel, which was a collision of straight time and swung time simultaneously, something that could have only been created on a machine. And now something that traditional musicians are emulating on their instruments. And that started with Dilla in a basement in Conant Gardens, in Detroit, in Michigan. And Dilla Time is the story of that, but how that relates to Detroit, and how that relates to the community of Michiganders, of Detroiters, young Detroiters who nurtured him, who worked with him, who were his collaborators.
Yeah, it was crazy, because when I was at the Detroit event and talking to some of the people, and they're saying, oh yeah, he didn't start out with a room full of computers. He started out with a karaoke machine that he would do these incredible beats on, where people would just sort of lose their mind of how is he even thinking to make that happen.
Yeah. And listen, that's what makes it such a Detroit story, because the first of it is the familiarity and the negotiation with the machine, which is a great Detroit story and a Michigan story. The fact that he has all these musical inclination is also a Detroit story, right? A family legacy immersed in Motown and the other parts of Michigan, music history. And then, the idea of innovation, right? Inventing things, that's, again, another great Detroit and Michigan legacy. So I don't know, man, that's why just having this conversation is so great for me, because I really, it's a love letter to Dilla, but it's also a love letter to the city and to the state.
See, and I've told you this when we've had conversations when you were here for the Night for Notable celebration. It's like, I'm a pretty big music guy. I'm interested in it.
Yeah.
And it was sort of like, why didn't I know about this guy? And I've bought several copies of your book to give to friends of mine who are music people. Of like, why wasn't this guy in our rotation when we were listening to stuff? And I mean, he does deserve a lot of credit for, you sort of think, oh, I could have done that, but you didn't. It was in his mind how he was able to incorporate this stuff and create a whole different kind of sound, which is, okay, maybe some of it is simplistic, but some of it's very complex. And all of that was happening in his mind and through his hands and ears to figure that out. So it's really incredible. When you look at the book, I mean, obviously a lot of time went into that. What was your favorite part of that process? And then when you're looking back on it, what maybe made you the proudest or brought you the most joy as you tackled that project and producing and writing Dillatime?
Oh man. Well, my facetious answer is always finishing. Finishing was the best part. Yeah, for me, that process of reporting, am I going to get the story? Am I going to get this? Am I going to get that? Is part and parcel of this. But I think those moments when I was able to get a little bit of reporting and write a passage that helped people understand Dilla in a way that they'd never been able to understand him before. A couple of things that come to mind are, Dilla, when he got sick in 2003, he had to go on dialysis, and to be able to talk to the Detroit legend, DJ Fingers, who was Dilla's sort of friend and helped mentor and guided him through this process of what it was to go on dialysis and to be on it. Small passage in the book, but super impactful to me, even to just read back. He had a long relationship with a paramour who became his girlfriend and fiance for a time, Joylette Hunter, another great Detroiter who has her own story. They had a child together, and there was a bit of conflict between Joylette and his mother, Maureen, and that was that was one of the most difficult things to report, because I was going back and forth between the two, trying to figure out what stories are mutually confirmed, what things have to sort of go down to the footnotes. And eventually I had to go to the Clinton Township Police Department to try to get any and all police reports that had come out of this particular address that Dilla lived at. And I had to file a FOIA request, and they filled it right before right before my manuscript had to be in. And I finished this book in Detroit. I was in a friend's house on Sycamore in North Corktown, and I just remember that email coming in, I can't believe it. I can't believe they filled this FOIA request, and they're the reports, and that's going to enable me to finish this section, stuff like that.
Yeah, the research was amazing in some parts of that. I mean, it did not go unnoticed, at least by this reader.
Oh, good, thanks.
Tell me, I mean, to us in Michigan, the Michigan Notable Books program and focusing on Michigan stories is really important. What did it mean to you to have your book selected a Michigan Notable Book?
I get a little teary thinking about it just now. I mean, it has a lot of different resonances. First, as a white person and a Jewish person who has spent my life writing about and immersed in Black culture, always understand that I am a guest, right? And that on certain levels, I have to negotiate some of the closeness that I have, but also some of the distance that I have. So that is double, right, for my feeling about Michigan, because people from Detroit are super proud. They've had a certain set of life experiences that I haven't had. So again, just feeling like a guest, trying to be a good guest in the city, trying to be a good guest in the state. And even with my long familiarity now with Michigan and Detroit, to have this book seen by the state of Michigan, for me, is just like a life moment for me. But also, I gotta say, being able to tell the stories of Dilla and his friends, whether we're talking about Wajid O'Brien or R.L. Altman, aka T3, or Titus Glover, aka Batin, or any of the Fat Cat, Ronnie Watts, like all of these kids, Detroit kids who grew up in Detroit at a time when the state had kind of turned its back and the country had turned its back on Detroit. To be able to say to them, look, your names are now enshrined in a book in the Library of Michigan. This book will be in the library of the state forever, right?
It's now part of Michigan history.
Right. To have those kids recognized as historical Michigan figures, to me, that's great. That's great.
Yeah. So, and if we haven't done it already, if we haven't sold the book enough, if someone's still saying, I don't know, I'm not into rap or hip hop, why should they read the book?
Well, look, every book I write, whether it's about mise en place and the life of the professional kitchen or hip hop, is just I'm trying to tell a good story and make sure I tell it well. And if you like good stories, this is a great story. And especially if you are a fierce Michigander or Detroiter, even if you have no direct relationship with hip hop or with Dilla, I'm hoping that this resonates with you. But it's just, a good story, hopefully well told.
Yeah, and he was obviously an underdog who
a great underdog story. Yeah.
Huge challenging situation. Yeah. So last question here. I always like to ask, what books, what authors have you been reading lately that you have been motivating you or causing jealousy in you? I wish I was writing or could produce something like this. What are you reading right now?
Well, I am reading Percival Everett's Dr. No, which is a really, really dense, brilliant work of fiction. And I picked that up after he won the Penn Award. And oh my goodness, what else? For it's really interesting. I think sometimes I come back in like difficult or challenging times in my life. I read a lot of World War II era books like Cornelius Ryan's The Longest Day and Rick Atkinson's series on the war in Europe, just because I know those books tell you what it is to really, really like go through struggle as a human being. And I don't know, I just find them, it's weird to think of a war book as being a comfort read, but for me, I keep going back to those books. And I'm also reading a book called Ronaldo v. Messi with my son, who's 13 years old. He's a big soccer fan. So I said, okay, we're going to read this book together this summer, and we're going to have a little book club and talk about it.
Hey, you're doing my librarian heart. Well, swells when parents are reading with kids. That's what it's all about. And I guess I should ask too, what are you listening to? What should I be listening to? What's new out there music wise that's causing you to stand up and notice it?
Wow, that's a great question. Well, I just heard the new album by Michelle Indegeocello, which is incredible for an artist who's been around since the 90s to do such another foundational work that's incredible. And shout out to DJ Aaron Halfacre in Detroit, who's the world's biggest Michelle Indegeocello fan, who got to tell me I told you so with regard to Michelle. And then Lil Sims, MC from London, who I love, who just put out a song called Gorilla and a video that's like amazing. So those are my obsessions this summer.
Cool, great. Well, thank you so much, Dan, for your time. Thank you for being part of the Michigan Notable Book Program. Thank you for doing the author tour. We've heard great feedback from the sessions that I was at. Was obviously a very good one, but the other ones as well. Yeah, your book is outstanding. I recommend people pick it up, go to their bookstore and buy it, go to the local public library and check it out. A great read. Thanks a lot, Dan.
Thank you.